gamers.
Hey, Chef, I think Jackson has got the hot boy.
Okay, listen up, people! We have an extremely hostile situation!
Unit lost.
During the 80s and 90s, most video game genres tended to stay squarely in their lanes. First-person shooters like Doom focused exclusively on gunning down monsters. Role-playing games like Ultima epitomized inventories and statistics, and stealth games like Thief prioritized sneaking through the shadows above all else. Every now and then, an experience like System Shock or Strife would come along and challenge the medium's self-imposed rigidness by melding multiple genres together. Yet many would argue it was only after the release of Deus Ex that the idea of a genre-bending game became truly popular. The brainchild of Warren Spector, Deus Ex allowed players to make their way through a cyberpunk rendition of the year 2052 using a wide variety of different mechanics and playstyles, allowing for an uncountable number of solutions to its lifelike quagmires. The experience that it provided was as stupendous in its execution as it was difficult to quantify, so much so that it would single-handedly usher in the term Immersive Sim to describe all prior and future games that would be included in its lineage. Countless developers would incorporate Deus Ex's most salient aspects into their craft in the wake of its release, and many would reap the benefits of doing so for years to come. Yet Deus Ex's own developers would struggle to fully capitalize on their opus's success, producing only a single underwhelming sequel in the years that would follow before being scattered to the wind. A passionate team based in Montreal would eventually take up the series' mantle and release a respectful reboot over a decade after the first game's debut. But in the end, despite following up said reboot with a solid sequel, the team would be forced to focus its efforts elsewhere, and the series would go dormant once more. This is the rise and fall of Deus Ex. Like many of the video game industry's preeminent designers, Warren Spector spent his formative years immersed in Dungeons & Dragons. The tabletop role-playing game hooked Spector from the moment he was introduced to it in 1978, and kept him entertained for years on end. He loved being guided through all manner of adventures by his dungeon master, Bruce Sterling, who did a stupendous job of keeping Spector engaged in its ever-evolving narrative. But what he loved even more was being able to inject his own elements to said adventures, such as defining who his character was, or determining how his character would overcome each obstacle they faced. The story of the campaign was Sterling's, but its details belonged to Spector and his friends, and to them alone. When Spector joined famed video game studio Origin Systems a decade later, he saw it as his mission to recreate the same sense of fulfillment that Dungeons & Dragons had provided him with in digital form, and hand it off to the next generation. Yet while many of his early projects at Origin featured mechanics and systems that called back to his tabletop experiences, it would only be in 1994 when Spector drafted up a proposal for a subversive action game called Troubleshooter that his aspirations as a designer would start to come to a head. Taking a cue from blockbusters like Die Hard and Dirty Harry, Spector envisioned Troubleshooter as a hard-boiled, noir-inspired action game, one that would entangle players in a host of dangerous situations and feature a richly simulated world akin to that of Ultimate Underworld, which he had helped to create 2 years prior. Where other games offered a highly stylized interpretation of real-life physics and logic, Troubleshooter would attempt to replicate the look and feel of reality, right down to the smallest detail. Origin rejected the proposal, but Spector would remark years later that this was probably for the best at the time. If he was going to provide an experience that replicated real life down to a T, he was going to need tremendously powerful computative technology on his side, and most commercially available computers in the mid-90s couldn't provide that. Origin's rejection of Troubleshooter also provided Spector with more time to ruminate on its design and realize how he could make its gameplay even more enticing. One such realization occurred a short while later, when Spector found himself helping Looking Glass Studios with the development of Thief: The Dark Project. While playtesting an early build of the game, Spector hit a segment that he found too difficult to sneak past, and promptly asked the rest of the team if he could fight his way out of the predicament instead. He believed that there was nothing wrong with being given the choice to brute force his way through, but almost everyone else was appalled by the idea. Thief was supposed to be a stealth game, not an action game. If players were provided with the option to use combat, the team reasoned, they would never resort to using stealth again. Unaccepting of this belief, Spector realized then and there that he had an opportunity with Troubleshooter to vindicate himself. He could use its lifelike world to create all manner of scenarios that players would be able to tackle using both lethal and non-lethal means, and demonstrate to his colleagues at Looking Glass that their fears were unfounded. The only question now was how he was going to find the funding to get Troubleshooter off the ground. The magnitude of such an undertaking would be massive, and while Spector was well respected within the industry, nobody was about to emerge out of the blue and offer him all of the money and resources he needed to achieve the game of his dreams. As a result, once his work at Looking Glass came to an end, Spector found himself on track to develop a role-playing game in the Command & Conquer universe for EA. Just before the deal could be fully inked, however, he received a call from one John Romero. The former id Software founder had just established a new development house called Ion Storm in Dallas, and he was willing to provide Spector with all of the money and resources that he needed to make the game of his dreams if he joined him. Realizing that his chance to develop Troubleshooter had just been handed to him on a silver platter, Spector agreed to Romero's offer, on the condition that he let him operate entirely out of Austin. Romero agreed, and within a matter of months, Spector was leading a team of colleagues at Ion Storm's Austin branch in what would become known as Deus Ex. In a post-mortem published years later on Gama Sutra, Spector would detail how much of the tenor for the rest of the project's development was set during this early period. Rather than rush through pre-production and begin building its world as quickly as possible, they spent a lengthy amount of time hammering out its setting and gameplay, in an effort to ensure that it would look and feel utterly unlike anything else that was on the market. Inspired by Americans' burgeoning fascination with conspiracy theories and television shows like The X-Files, the team reimagined the game's action movie-inspired world as a cyberpunk dystopia where secret organizations run rampant. In this brave yet strange new backdrop, players would assume the role of J.C. Denton, a counter-terrorism operative capable of imbuing himself with superhuman abilities through the use of nano-augmentations. Super strength, invisibility, night vision, and a host of other powers would be available at players' fingertips and would be combinable with other, more conventional mechanics, such as shooting, sneaking, and hacking, to allow for all manner of gameplay possibilities. These gameplay possibilities would in turn take place in locales around the globe, including dense hub cities like New York and Hong Kong, and would occur parallel to a sprawling story that would see Denton attempt to uncover a planet-threatening plot. Unlike its gameplay, however, the team decided early on to keep this story almost entirely linear and straightforward. Players would be able to customize Denton's personality and motivations via conversations with the rest of the game's characters, but they would almost always be drawn into the same narrative beats. Much like with his early Dungeons & Dragons sessions, Spector believed that so long as players had intimate control over the details of the campaign, they wouldn't mind being strung along to someone else's plot. All of this early conceptualizing provided the team with an exciting yet focused vision to strive towards once the heavy lifting of Deus Ex's development began. But even with this tailwind behind their backs, the team found themselves dealing with a host of challenges over the course of its development, both external and self-imposed. In his Gama Sutra post-mortem, Spector would recall making the mistake of splitting up his designers early on into two separate groups, one a traditional RPG group, the other an immersive sim-oriented group. Because everyone was trying to make a game that would burst genre boundaries, he believed a little competition between the two would lead to interesting ideas, and that he'd be able to manage any excess tension that would result from this. In the end, however, this experiment only helped sow discord, and Spector eventually realized the project would be much better off if everyone was grouped under one banner. This early infighting was followed by artificial intelligence problems, overscoped level ideas that needed to be painfully cut, and an unruly engine that didn't mesh well with the team's ambitions. On top of all of this, the team was also forced to deal with the stress that came with working under the Ion Storm name during the late 90s. By the end of the decade, a mixture of overly aggressive advertising campaigns, undelivered promises, and worrying previews of the first-person shooter Daikatana, which Romero was busy working on at Ion Storm's Dallas branch, had spurned countless gamers into becoming immensely vitriolic towards the studio, leaving all who were working on Deus Ex adrift in a sea of discontent. Even though much of the hostility they received wasn't specifically directed at them, most of the Austin branch employees found it difficult not to take heat personally, or outright fear for their project's future. But in time, this hostility also became a backhanded source of motivation for the team. It made them more determined than ever to prove to the world that their studio was capable of living up to its bellicose claims, that its unique combination of talent and moxie wasn't just for show. The team also received decent support throughout the entire process from its publisher, Eidos Interactive. Eidos had signed on to help fund all of Ion Storm's projects since its founding in 1996, and had gradually acquired greater and greater stakes in the company's affairs over time. But even after it fully acquired the entirety of the studio in the middle of 1999, the publisher abstained from meddling all that much in its Austin branch's affairs. By a quirk of fate, just a little over a month after Romero's own team put out Daikatana, Spector's team would finally end up releasing Deus Ex in June of 2000. The former had proved a massive flop, and left many players feeling vindicated about their animosity towards Ion Storm. But when they switched over to give Deus Ex its due, opinions were quickly swayed. Almost everyone was in agreement that its gameplay was as deep and flexible as advertised, and that its writing was appropriately moody and compelling. In a market saturated with cookie-cutter first-person shooters and action games, Deus Ex stood out as a genuine breath of fresh air, a subversive experience that other intellectually minded titles before it, like System Shock or Thief, could be more than envious of. And unlike System Shock or Thief, which had never been tremendously profitable, Deus Ex would actually manage to translate this subversive quality in sales, selling over 1 million units in the months following its launch. By the time that word had spread about Deus Ex's excellence, Ion Storm was already hard at work on a sequel, subtitled Invisible War. From the get-go, everyone assigned to the project was excited to dive back into the series' universe and figure out how to make it even better. Everyone, except for Spector. Speaking to GameSpy in 2003, Spector would explain how after spending over 4 years of his life utterly and emotionally entrenched in the first Deus Ex's development, the thought of diving back into another one was too much to handle. He felt it necessary to distance himself from its production, and so he decided to put Harvey Smith in charge of Invisible War instead. A longtime colleague of Spector's, Smith had gotten his start at Origin Systems in quality assurance, before eventually climbing up to become a designer on titles like Cybermage and then the lead designer on the original Deus Ex. Under Smith's leadership, the team did its best to craft a sequel that would offer a drastically more improved and accessible gameplay experience. Everyone at the company was indebted to the hardcore for making the original Deus Ex popular, but the cost of game development was rising with each passing year. The idea of designing a sequel solely for the first game's player base no longer made sense, and by the summer of 2001, the team couldn't rely on the aid of Ion Storm's Dallas branch any longer to help them remain afloat, due to the latter being shut down by Eidos. If they were going to remain financially solvent, they were going to need to reach an even wider audience than before. And reaching this wider audience meant smoothing over some of the first game's more rigid aspects, while offering greater opportunities for role-playing. Multiple ammo types were exchanged for a single universal ammo type that all guns in the game would use. Multiple leveling systems were changed into a more streamlined biomod system, and JC Denton was swapped out for Alex D, a new protagonist whose gender and general appearance could be customized at the beginning of the game. Numerous in-game factions which one could swap between were added in as well, in an effort to further let players define their purpose in the experience around them. In the midst of all this, the team was also convinced by focus testers to set Invisible War several decades after the first, as well as to adopt an overall visual style that was more evocative of straight-up science fiction than cyberpunk. While all of these changes resulted in the sequel feeling substantially different from its predecessor, almost everyone at the studio would later agree that what made Invisible War feel most distinct from the original Deus Ex, and what pained them the most during development, were the limitations of the platform that it was developed for. Instead of being developed for home computers, Invisible War was developed from day one for both the Xbox and the PC, with the PC version approached as a port of the console version. This created a host of technical headaches for the team and forced them to make a number of concessions to its design, including severely decreasing the sizes of its levels. When Invisible War eventually released at the end of 2003, most reviewers initially received the game warmly, finding the ways in which it evolved the original Deus Ex's gameplay and world to be enjoyable, and the quality of its level design more consistent. As more players got their hands on it, however, the more their love of it would sour. It became apparent that for all of its improvements in terms of accessibility, the sequel simply didn't allow for the same level of experimentation and freedom as its predecessor, with the reduced size of its levels making it more difficult to figure out what one's options were in a moment of crisis. And while not all would come down on Invisible War's more futuristic setting, most would agree that it wasn't nearly as evocative as the original Deus Ex's. Both Smith and Spector would later concede to many of these criticisms, with Spector admitting that in retrospect, he probably should have made more of an effort to help guide Smith's decisions instead of keeping his distance. However, he would also stand by that it was still a better game than most people gave it credit for, and that in the end, anything that would have followed the original Deus Ex, even if it were absolutely flawless, would have probably ended up living in its shadow. After the release of Invisible War, Spector stuck around briefly at Ion Storm to help conceptualize Deus Ex Insurrection. According to a 2014 Eurogamer article, Insurrection was being headed up by Invisible War programmer Art Min, and would have followed J.C. Denton's father in an international conspiracy set prior to the first game's events. The game's overall design would have been similar to that of its predecessors, but more grounded and ambitious. When not in the middle of a mission, for example, players would be able to retreat to a home base, where they would be able to prepare for their trials ahead, as well as recruit an eclectic team of allies to their cause. Despite showing promise, Spector ultimately decided to close the book on Insurrection before it could enter production, and leave Ion Storm to found Junction Point Studios alongside Min. While their departure didn't bode well for the Austin-based studio, those who would remain within its walls would do their best over the following months to find a path forward for the series, conceptualizing another, even more ambitious concept for its third entry before Eidos finally closed the studio down in 2005. The second version of Deus Ex 3, which was spearheaded by Thief, Deadly Shadows designer Jordan Thomas, was envisioned as taking place in an open-world New Orleans and featuring a generative system that would create unique missions based on one's in-game actions. In the midst of all this, a third attempt to create Deus Ex 3 also quietly took place at Redwood City-based developer Crystal Dynamics, which tasked itself with developing a more combat-centric threequel titled Deus Ex: Clan Wars. The latter ended up gradually evolving into its own entity over the course of its production, and was eventually renamed Project Snowblind to set it apart from its original namesake. While this arguably resulted in much of the industry passing it by when it released in 2005, those who picked it up would praise it for the quality of its combat and breakneck pacing.
Doc, we got problems. We're losing him.
The future of Deus Ex was looking grim. With Ion Storm gone, the series' property rights were now in Eidos Interactive's hands alone. And while the publisher understood the brand power that it contained, it was anyone's guess as to when or whether it would act upon it. Yet no sooner had the possibility of the series being over entered fans' minds than Eidos would open a new studio in Montreal and announce that it was hard at work on Deus Ex: Human Revolution. In many ways, the development of Human Revolution would parallel that of the original Deus Ex. Like Ion Storm Austin before it, Eidos Montreal represented a team coming together for the first time to tackle a massive undertaking. They spent a considerable amount of time scoping out their version of the threequel during the early days of its production, exhaustively noting down everything that they liked and disliked about the first two games to help set the tone for what was to come. And once development was in high gear, they were forced to contend with technology issues, cut no small amount of content, and deal with a powerful, yet ultimately supportive new publisher that acquired it partway through. In this case, the publisher was Square Enix, which saw fit to purchase all of Eidos Interactive's assets in early 2009. Despite its history of working primarily with Eastern properties like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, Square quickly came to respect Eidos Montreal's dedication to its craft after the acquisition, and let its staff continue development largely unabated. Yet Human Revolution's development would also differ from that of the original Deus Ex, perhaps most critically, when Eidos Montreal would scope out what it wanted the threequel to explore on a thematic level. Instead of taking place in the year 2052, the team decided to have human revolution take place in 2027, a time where physical augmentations are being embraced at an unparalleled rate, and the world is in the middle of a new renaissance of transhumanism wonder. Speaking to Edge magazine in 2010, game director Jean-François Degueur and art director Jonathan Jack Bellatet would explain how they believed going back in time and showing a society that is slowly exchanging its humanity for mechanical parts would make for a powerful aesthetic effect, as well as allow them to underscore the entire experience with a foreboding sense of tragedy. Eidos Montreal would likewise go against the grain in its design of Human Revolution's protagonist, a former SWAT team leader turned augmented weapon named Adam Jensen. While the team understood the importance of making Jensen a cipher for players to lay their own personality onto, like the original Deus Ex's J.C. Denton, they ultimately decided to provide Jensen with a more well-defined personality off the bat, and to provide players with opportunities to observe his actions in battle from a third-person perspective. It was their belief that, in the long run, these changes would help players connect more deeply with Jensen as a character. Human Revolution was an opportunity for older fans to come home, but it was also a chance to introduce a new generation of players to the unparalleled sense of freedom that the series uniquely provided. The studio wanted to create an experience that would honor Ion Storm's classics, but it also understood the importance of needing to appeal to more modern sensibilities.
Stand down!
As Human Revolution's release date barreled closer and closer, fans were beset by a mixture of excitement, hope, and caution. It was unthinkable that Deus Ex was finally getting a comeback, and that Eidos Montreal, despite its tenuous connection to the team which had created the series, seemed to understand what made it tick. But there were no shortage of video game reboots over the past several years that had sacrificed their identity and depth in favor of cheap thrills, and there was no way of telling whether Human Revolution would fall into the same camp until it was out on store shelves. At the end of the day, they needn't have worried. When Human Revolution finally released in August of 2011, most fans found Eidos Montreal's freshman effort to be well worthy of praise. While the complexity of its gameplay was a notch below what the first game had offered, and its portrayal of Adam Jensen occasionally left something to be desired, the experience that it offered was still no less exceptional, with almost every single level and hub city in the game serving as a playground for Jensen's bionic arsenal and creativity, as well as a showcase for Eidos Montreal's writing acumen. And its visual style, with its unconventionally warm color palette, helped make every minute of it feel all the more special. The only major aspect of Human Revolution that most took umbrage with were its boss battles, which forced players into straightforward slugfests where stealth and hacking were of little use. They weren't outright terrible, but they felt fundamentally at odds with the rest of the game's design. Eidos Montreal would later reveal that these battles had been outsourced to an external developer called Grip Entertainment, and how even before doing so, it hadn't done a very good job of laying out how the battles would be integrated into the rest of the experience during the early days of production. In the end, the studio would manage to smooth things over in 2013 with the Director's Cut release of Human Revolution. The Director's Cut dramatically overhauled the game's boss encounters to allow for more tactical options, and integrated a host of new bells and whistles into the rest of its proceedings, including an entirely new chapter that had previously only been available as downloadable content. This title would follow the release of a high-budget mobile game spin-off called Deus Ex: The Fall, and ultimately coincide with Eidos formally announcing the Deus Ex universe. The story of Deus Ex, Eidos promised, would no longer play out on PCs and consoles alone. It would play out across smartphones, books, and graphic novels with unique experiences tailored to each platform, and it would do so for years to come. What was once just a video game series was now a massive multimedia franchise in the making. While this mandate suggested to fans that whatever was set to follow Human Revolution would be vast in scope, Eidos Montreal had by this point already set its sights on crafting a much different sort of sequel. In a 2019 interview with VG247, Adam Jensen voice actor Elias Tufexis would reveal how in the immediate aftermath of Human Revolution, the studio initially wanted to develop a sequel without Jensen at all. Its marketing department quickly convinced them to abandon this idea and continue capitalizing on Jensen's popularity. But even after this was agreed on, the team decided to keep the sequel structure unorthodox. Players would be able to globetrot around the world to a variety of different locales, but the meat of its action, they decided, would take place in and around a single dense hub, one that would provide them with plenty of opportunity to explore their surroundings and breathe in the unrest hanging in its air. After weighing its options, the studio decided upon the city of Prague as this area, and a boiling animosity towards augmented humans as the unrest. Where Human Revolution had largely focused on humanity's embrace of augmentations, Mankind Divided would focus on their fear and rejection of them, as well as the trauma of the planet still recovering from the first game's events. The studio likewise resolved to offer a much higher degree of verticality and complexity in each of Mankind Divided's areas in order to ensure every inch of the experience felt equally improved over its predecessor. Despite their best efforts, all of this would end up taking the team over 5 years to develop. In an interview with Rolling Stone ahead of its release, Eidos Montreal's Mary DeMarle and Patrick Fortier would explain how a mixture of technological and narrative-based complications made the process of assembling Mankind Divided's world much more labor-intensive than anyone was anticipating, and how the complexity of its environment only dragged things out further. While a few entries in the expanded Deus Ex universe helped keep fans occupied during this period, including the puzzle-centric Deus Ex Go, the wait was long, and was made all the more so by Mankind Divided's marketing, which included an awkward allusion to a certain political movement and a badly received pre-order bonus campaign. As a result, when Mankind Divided finally released in 2016, players were relieved to discover that the actual game at the center of all these marketing blunders was uncompromised, at least up until the end. Most agreed that Prague made for one of the strongest city hubs featured in the entire history of the series, and that the quality of its writing generally serviced its dire ambience well. But after spending dozens of hours immersed in its fiction, most were equally frustrated to discover all of its rising intrigue undercut by a stunningly abrupt ending. Many fans would go on to speculate that Square Enix had deliberately forced Eidos Montreal to chop off the true conclusion to Mankind Divided's story, perhaps out of a desire to spread out its content over multiple releases and maximize its profit potential. While it's unlikely that this actually happened, multiple sources have indicated that Eidos did have a dedicated team working on a follow-up to Divided towards the end of its development. According to a trusted source, this project entered development as early as 2015 and was downsized when Square pulled multiple people off of it to help finish Divided. Elias Tufexis would likewise confirm in his VG 24/7 interview that the sequel was relatively early in production and in an awkward spot. Apparently, disagreements over its direction resulted in 2 months of performance work being scrapped and a new team of creatives being brought on board to course correct. Everyone thereafter was ready to continue moving forward. But before they could do so, Square Enix came to the decision that Mankind Divided had performed below expectations, and the follow-up was put on hold.
No inmates pass this line.
Hold on.
Over the course of the next 6 months, Eidos Montreal would treat fans to a smattering of episodic DLC, a VR experience based around Mankind Divided locales, and a standalone version of Divided's Breach Mode. All of these releases suggested that even with Mankind Divided's underperformance, Square Enix was still interested in continuing to support the Deus Ex universe in at least some capacity. 3 years onward, however, and the universe has been all but abandoned. No new Deus Ex projects are on the horizon, and little of the talent that helped bring the series back into the limelight is in a position to do so again. Square Enix CEO Yosuke Matsuda has insisted that Deus Ex remains a very important franchise for the publisher, and that it's only dormant at the moment because the publisher's current slate of projects have left it short-handed for resources. But even with this assurance, there's still no way of knowing whether it will return to the franchise when the opportunity will present itself, or even if said opportunity will ever present itself at all. For many longtime fans, the current situation is as frustrating as it is tragic. Video game series come and go all the time, with audiences' ever-changing tastes forcing even the most popular of experience to go into hibernation. But for a brief period, it seemed as if Deus Ex had managed to defy this cycle and find a way to connect with modern audiences without needing to compromise its soul. And it seemed as if it was on track to become bigger than ever before. Adam Jensen might have never asked for the predicament that his creators thrust him into, but almost everyone is asking for a chance to help him break free of it. Thank you for watching. We'd like to take this time to thank, by name, the generous patrons who have pledged to our Hall of Fame reward tier: Caleb Shishkevich, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Maktoum Saeed Al Maktoum, Paul Cousineau, and those currently subscribed to our producer reward tier: Darirab Sigurdsson, EmuMovies.com, Lame Game Man, Milkshake, Schizo Lingvo. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to our channel and backing us on Patreon.